Hey everybody, I want to record this video about Mick the Vegan's response to the Epic Oxford study. I think it's very misleading. I don't think he knows what he's talking about a lot of the time. And I wanted to just clear up the record. It's starting to really frustrate me what's going on vegan YouTube. I've probably blocked most of the keto people on Twitter. The vegan people aren't super active on Twitter. They're just basically like save the animals, which is laudable. I think that whenever I go to YouTube and start watching vegan YouTube, it drives me batty. So I want this video to be the beginning of a few videos addressing some of that, just because most of these people are on YouTube. So let's talk about it. Let's basically comment on the video.
To the recent media blitz led by the BBC to make everybody believe that vegan and vegetarians have higher risk of strokes.
They do have higher risk of strokes.
It was based off a BMJ article that was very recently published. The message is clear: eat plants and be very afraid because your brain is gonna pop.
That's not the message at all. He's just stoking outrage at the BBC and about this particular issue, and in order to basically rally his tribe, his in-group. The name of the game in modern social media is to get as much clicks as possible. In order to do that, you have to spread outrage. Outrage also rallies the tribe, in this case, vegans, and that boosts his following and makes people like his videos.
Of course,
So the point is that that's actually not what the BBC actually said. The BBC just said that you have a higher stroke rate, not anything else. That's higher stroke rate if you're a vegan. It didn't say anything else, that your brain's going to explode, everything's going to be bad. It just said your higher stroke rate if you're a vegan. It's just an important, useful piece of information. It's a scientific piece of information. It has nothing to do with your existence and the goodness or badness of your life, how bad things are going to be for you, anything like that. It just has to do with a scientific fact. So let's get that straight.
Crack open the study at the root of this. We're going to look at what it actually says and what the implications are, and compare it to another very recent study that just objectively used better methodologies and studied a very similar thing.
So it doesn't use better methodologies, it's using an entirely different methodology, which is not at all the same as the methodology used for the Epic Oxford study. This is called a meta-analysis, a systematic review, which basically collects all of the studies together that have been done to this point, then analyzes them as a whole and comes up with a conclusion based upon what the totality of evidence say, although it's not necessarily totality of evidence. We can talk about that at some other time. But basically, it says what the whole of the literature says, according to some specific methodology. Whereas this study is one of those studies, essentially, except it's been done after this particular meta-analysis. It's one of those studies that then feeds into future meta-analyses. So think of it as primary, a reading of the primary literature versus reading the secondary literature. This is a commentary on the literature that's been done. This new study is actually the generation of new, or the reporting of new data that will then be further analyzed. So it's an entirely different analysis. It's not better or worse. He doesn't know what he's talking about.
We're also going to look at the words of an expert who makes a very compelling case that no, in fact,
the words of an expert appeal to authority.
Vegetarians and vegans do not have higher stroke risks. And finally, we are going to
if he says they don't have higher stroke risks, this expert's wrong.
Look at how, no, even if they did have higher stroke risks, they're...
Why would you have to say even if they did have higher stroke risks if they don't have higher stroke risks?
Not worse off in terms of overall health. All right, let's go. I have to mention, right after I went to bed late last night after releasing...
Okay, before we even get into this, I want to continue on that point. If they don't have higher stroke risks, then you wouldn't need to address the possibility that they might have higher stroke risks, which basically means that this expert opinion is nonsense. He knows this expert opinion is nonsense because it's not how science is done, just quoting some expert. So he then has to reinforce his argument and try to defend it, through the back route. But the whole point is that he's just trying to defend a position rather than actually be objective.
A video on a British medical journal article, scaring people about vegan brain health. Of course, I open it up to another British medical journal.
And by the way, the stuff about choline and brain health is important. There are world experts who believe that choline might be very important to preventing neurodegeneration. The evidence for that is still very scant, and the reason is that we don't really know that much about the relationship between choline and the brain, meaning that we don't really know whether or not choline is really important for long-term brain health, but there are people who think that there's a plausible argument to be made for that. So, and there's certainly nobody who believes that that's absolutely false. Or that's probably false because again, we just don't have that much information. So when people point out that choline might be important for brain health, what they're doing is they're just pointing out a scientific fact. They're not trying to scare people. And the fact is whenever you choose to be a vegan, you're not forced into being it. So you can't be scared like as this like victimized vegan. You choose to be a vegan, and you choose to be a vegan based upon objective evidence about what the risks and benefits are to yourself, to the world. And so it's a choice. So you can't be scared and you can't be afraid vegan. You just make a decision based upon what the evidence says. And this person seems to think that you're sort of victimized into being a vegan. You're just a vegan who's passively receiving this information that's either scaring you or making you feel good. And he's trying to make you feel good. My opinion is like, if you make a decision about your diet, be proud about it and make it based on rational grounds. And you're not somebody who's going to be scared by something. You're not somebody who's going to be rah-rah. You're making a decision that makes sense or doesn't make sense.
Article that's at least being used to scare people about vegan brain health. It never ends. And the first on the scene appears to be that BBC article, which was then, of course, echoed by other articles, essentially copy and pasted in the same format. I mean, look at this. The Independent article, Bloomberg as well, same narrative, definitely deserving of a Pulitzer Prize.
It's not the same narrative, it's a fact.
We're going to start by unpacking the BBC article because that's what most people saw first. And honestly, even just the headline is what most people are going to see and carry to the grave and think for eternity. Now, every time they see a vegetarian or vegan in the future, regardless of how healthy they actually are, they're going to be like, oh, you'll probably die of a stroke anyway.
I think he needs some choline.
Eat my meat. But let's go deeper than the title, all the way to the subheading, which says the veg group actually has lower levels of heart disease, something that, wasn't put in the title. I wonder why.
Because everybody knows that being a vegetarian and not eating meat lowers your risk of heart disease, except for the denialists.
Why? Gotta get those clicks. To be fair, the article also said, quote, however, it cannot prove whether the effect is down to their diet or some other aspect of their lifestyle. We will see when we look at the actual study, but of course they had to finish it off with, and there was a call last month for vegans to be aware of the need to ensure that they were consuming enough of another nutrient called choline, important for brain health, linking to a previous article.
Consuming enough choline is important.
It's like the BBC sits down at the beginning of every month and they're like, all right, what's the attack plan on vegans for this month? We need to...
There's not an attack plan. Consuming enough choline is important because it is important for all sorts of processes in the body, not just brain health, but a lot of different things. And it's important for people to know that being on a vegan diet makes it more difficult to get choline. That's not, we're going to launch an attack on vegans. It's like, hey, you guys need to know this because you guys need to watch out for your health.
To meet the demand for good news about your bad habits. And if you haven't watched my very recent video on choline, spoiler alert, the nutritionist who wrote it is in bed with...
Who cares?
Virtually every choline special interest there is.
That's totally irrelevant because the issue is the science, not this one particular person. And there's a lot of people who think these kinds of things, not just this one particular person. Maybe this person is in bed with all these people because she believes in choline. Not she believes in choline because she's in bed with these people.
All right, moving on. All right, enough of the BBC. Let's look at the actual article. This is a study that looked at
Thank goodness we're looking at the actual article.
48,000 people. For some, it was up to 18 years of tracking them. And this is an observational study. It's not a clinical trial. It's not a dietary intervention. Therefore, it is not capable of proving cause and effect.
Nothing is capable of proving cause and effect, not even experiments in the lab. The point is, basically, whenever you're in the lab, you do one thing and something happens. Now, you can control many different variables until you get to the point where you feel confident that one particular variable is responsible for that particular effect, but you can never be 100% confident, so you can never actually prove cause and effect, even in laboratory experiments. The difference between an observational study and something, say, in a lab, an experimental study, is that in an observational study, you have to control the variables after the fact, whereas in the lab, you control the variables before the fact. Controlling the variables after the fact is difficult because you don't know necessarily what all the variables are. Whereas controlling the variables before the fact, you can have a better idea of what those variables are because, hey, you're there, you're doing that particular experiment. And then there's some other issues with confounders and randomization and all sorts of things. But the point is that laboratory experiments and observational studies are not actually different in the fact that one can establish cause and effect. Neither can establish cause and effect. One is just more capable of isolating variables and more definitively establishing the link between causative effect, but neither can do it 100%, and it's more of a matter of degree than it is a matter of kind.
Worth mentioning. The most important finding right off the bat for people who want to drag vegan.
And before we continue on with that, we need observational studies because we can't actually do RCTs with a bunch of vegans versus a bunch of meat eaters and look at the long-term outcomes. It's just not feasible. It's not going to happen for a very long time. Maybe someday, but not now. So we have to make decisions based upon the information we have right now. We can't make decisions based upon information we might have some other time because we have to make decisions now. We have to say, do I eat this particular food now? Do I not eat this particular food now? Therefore, you have to go with the best evidence. So we need observational studies, and they are really important to inform our decisions.
Is that there were no statistically significant vegan-specific findings in the study, meaning you can't make any meaningful vegan-specific claims from the data. And
that's true.
Earlier I referred to it as the veg group because they actually clumped vegans and vegetarians together so that it would be statistically significant, and it's worth mentioning from other EPIC Oxford studies, that's the data set that they used, about 85 to 90% of vegetarians are not vegan, only a small portion of them are, and this veg group absolutely did not have a vegan profile. For example, looking at cholesterol levels, the meat eaters were at 212 total, the vegetarian group, that veg group, was at 193, when vegans averaged down around 150 milligrams per deciliter. The veg group was also, get this, eating only 22 grams of fiber per day when the meat eaters were up at like 18, basically no more fiber. What were they eating? How could they eat that little fiber? I mean, just a cup of beans has like 15 grams of fiber.
I agree with that.
And most vegans are probably up around like 60 to 80. No,
that's wrong. And the reason that's wrong is because we know that from the EPIC Oxford study, and they've actually reported dietary intakes. If he'd take a chance to actually look at this, then he would know that they're not around 60 to 80. I think he said they're actually around, so the meat eaters in this particular grams of NSP. What is even NSP? Anyway, in this particular reporting of, I see why it's different. It's because it's splitting women and men. Okay, so if you look at men for fiber, 30 grams per day in the vegan group, meat eaters 22 grams, vegetarians 27 grams. So if we're going to compare vegans and vegetarians among men, it's a 3-gram difference. It's not 60 grams, 80 grams versus 25 grams. It's 30 grams versus 27 grams among men, and then among women, it's about 27 grams versus 24 grams. And that's the difference. I'm not really sure. I think that this is from a different like slice of the EPIC study. I'm not exactly sure why the meat eaters are a little bit lower here, but the point is you're not going to find anything different between, you're not going to find much difference between the vegetarians and the vegans in terms of the fiber intake. It's completely wrong what he's saying.
No surprise that the veg group ate more cheese.
And so the point for that is that if you're looking at the average vegan in the population, if you actually care about the average vegan in the population, perhaps even the average vegan that's actually watching his video, the EPIC Oxford study is actually really relevant.
Than the meat eaters, but that being said, they were still healthier in many other ways. For example, non-dietary ways such as smoking less, and this is very important for later. Now I want to get to the expert opinion here, and this is from a cardiologist named Malcolm Finley of the Barts Health Center and Queen Mary University of London. He said, quote,
So he's literally quoting an expert without any data. It's just some guy's opinion.
The data they present show that people who follow a vegetarian diet or just not eating meat were significantly healthier than meat eaters. This stretches right across the board. Not only did vegetarians have less heart attacks and strokes, but also less high blood pressure, fewer medications, and fewer were diabetic. Wait, what? Less strokes? What do you mean, Malcolm? Enlighten me. He goes on to say, quote, unfortunately, the claim that vegetarians have a higher risk of strokes isn't really supported by the data, and on my reading, this is putting too much weight on a complex statistical method to try and correct for the fact that the vegetarians were very much healthier than the meat eaters.
This is just wrong. We know that hemorrhagic stroke happens more in people who don't eat as much meat. We know that it happens in response to LDL reducing interventions. The reason is probably that so the reason is probably something to do with the fact that LDL levels and high lipid levels correlate with high coagulation. There could be other reasons as well. Evan Allen says that hemorrhagic stroke is caused by hypertension. That might be true, but if you have hypertension and maybe you have less coagulation, then you're more likely to get a hemorrhagic as opposed to an ischemic stroke. Now, that is to say, however, that vegans and vegetarians do have a lower rate of ischemic stroke, and it is very surprising in this particular study that the hemorrhagic stroke increase, the rate of increase actually outstripped the rate of decrease of ischemic stroke. In a lot of studies, that's actually not the case, as far as I know. And so it is an interesting finding, but the rate of hemorrhagic stroke among vegans and vegetarians and people who don't eat meat in general and animal products in general, and people who lower the LDL, it's very consistently, or relatively, it's very common. It's extremely common. I bet there's at least 100 studies, and I'm not exaggerating. I bet there's at least 100 studies that will show that finding of increased rate of hemorrhagic stroke in these kinds of populations. So it's not, it's a well-established, and among experts, it's a well-established and universally accepted feature of the literature that isn't very well understood. Let's go.
This is almost certainly because their conclusions are based on adjusted hazard ratios, where the researcher basically put the question, what if the meat eaters didn't have higher blood pressure, and use moderately complicated statistics to adjust the likelihood of stroke and heart attack and so on. And this only works if there isn't an interaction between the baseline characteristics. So this may be another case of possible over-adjusting. In other words, that the meat-eating group was so unhealthy that the researchers got lost in a statistical jungle, so they take that actual lower stroke risk in vegetarians, they go, oh, well, it's actually, and few strokes isn't really supported by the data, and on my reading, this is putting too much weight on a complex statistical method to try and correct for the fact that the vegetarians were very much healthier than the meat eaters. This is almost certainly because their conclusions are based on adjusted hazard ratios, where the researcher basically put the question...
Okay, so I understand what he's saying. So let's say, for example, blood pressure is really important for stroke, and then you correct for blood pressure. So basically the idea is maybe the meat eaters have a much higher blood pressure and the vegetarians have a much lower blood pressure. Well, then if you correct for blood pressure and you look at people only, basically you look at people only at the same blood pressure level, you check to see, oh, at that same blood pressure level, the vegans or the vegetarians are having a much higher rate of, or substantially higher rate of stroke. That's what he's basically saying. So basically, the innate characteristics of meat eaters, they're basically ignoring, and they're looking at all else equal, and not everything is equal. The meat eaters are more unhealthy, but if you made everything equal in terms of the healthy meat eater versus the healthy vegetarian, even though on average meat eaters are less healthy, then you would find a higher stroke risk among vegetarians. That's still something to be concerned about, because then the question is if you became a meat eater who became as healthy as a vegetarian, would you still have that same high rate of stroke? And according to this statistical analysis, the answer is no. So the idea behind this statistical analysis is if you become a meat eater and become as healthy as the average vegetarian, you'll actually have a lower risk of stroke than the vegetarians. And I don't think that's an unimportant thing to point out at all.
What if the meat eaters didn't have higher blood pressure and use moderately complicated statistics to adjust the likelihood of stroke and heart attack and so on? And this only works if there isn't an interaction between the baseline characteristics. So this may be another case of possible over-adjusting. In other words,
it depends on the question that you're trying to ask. If you just want to make vegetarianism look good, yeah, it's over-adjusting.
That the meat-eating group was so unhealthy that the researchers got lost in a statistical jungle, so they take...
This is wrong.
Take that actual lower stroke risk in vegetarians, they go, oh, well, it's actually going to be a little higher because of the smoking adjustment, and then it's going to be higher because of the little BMI adjustment, you know, the cholesterol adjustment, and then we're also going to do the high blood pressure adjustment. When the researchers were dialing down these...
All that's really important because, again, the question is if you're a healthy meat eater, as healthy as the average vegetarian, is your stroke rate going to be less than the average vegetarian? And the answer is yes, and that's a really important thing to know.
Stroke numbers, they actually might have gone a little too far. This notion makes sense on a few levels, first of which the general principle is that if a certain population has more heart disease, they also tend to have more stroke. Looking at WHO data here across the world, that is the case. More heart disease and more stroke are very connected, but it's the opposite in this study. And that makes sense in terms of the mechanism. Heart attack and stroke are usually from a ruptured lesion in the artery wall. It's just a matter of where it is. Now for what appears to be the final nail in the coffin on this vegan and vegetarian equals stroke notion. Looking to this recent meta-analysis.
It's not the opposite in this study versus the other studies. It's very obvious when you lower LDL, you decrease cardiovascular disease risk through some sort of intervention like statins or being plant-based or whatever. It's incredibly common. In fact, it's a recurring theme. It's something you see all the time in the literature, that you get a higher risk of hemorrhagic stroke. Again, the risk of ischemic stroke tends to go down, but the risk of hemorrhagic stroke goes up. It's true that on a population level, as rate of heart attacks goes up, then you're going to get a higher rate of stroke. But with these kinds of interventions to do with diet and LDL, it doesn't work like that.
That's just a couple months old, but interestingly didn't make headlines. It also included Epic Oxford data as just a fraction of the 7 studies that they looked at on about 200,000 people. Again, this is a meta-analysis of observational studies, obviously more powerful than a single observational study.
The single observational study is a new study that wasn't included in that meta-analysis. It's important to have new studies so that we can include them in meta-analyses.
And they found a very similar 22% lower heart disease risk, but interestingly, they found an 8% lower stroke risk, though it wasn't statistically significant.
It's not an 8% lower stroke risk if it's not statistically significant.
But it was not a higher risk at all. But I want to move on and play along with the idea that, maybe these vegetarians actually did have...
Well, the reason it might not be higher in that particular study is because maybe they did the HR analysis different, and that doesn't mean that one study is right and one study is wrong. Different studies ask different questions.
Have higher stroke risk. Well, the reality is, even if they did, they would still be better off. They would still be healthier. Here's why. Heart disease kills way more people in the UK than stroke does. Even the BBC article hinted at this if you were paying attention to the numbers, with 10 less cases of heart disease and 3 more of stroke. So what would the study's implications mean for the UK, where the study was done? Well, looking at stroke death, we have 32,000 a year, and looking at heart disease deaths, there's 73,000 a year. That's over twice as many deaths from heart disease. Now let's open a scenario up where all of the UK goes vegetarian and see how it works. Well, it brings us from 73,000 heart disease deaths down to roughly 57,000. Not a perfect number, but good enough for this. And playing along, stroke would rise from 32,000 to 38,000 if everyone went vegetarian. So in the meat eater world, we're looking at approximately 105,000 deaths a year.
Let's make sure he's got those numbers right. Yeah, that's right. That's roughly
so in the meat eater world, we're looking at approximately 105,000 deaths a year from cardiovascular events. But in the vegetarian model, we're looking at 95,000. That's 10,000 less deaths, which is huge. Heck, the lead researcher even said, quote, "It does seem that the lower risk of coronary heart disease does exceed the higher risk of stroke if we look at the absolute numbers."
Yeah.
But most of the media did include that quote from her, and they ran with all the fear-mongering about going on a plant-based diet. And this study came out somewhat recently in the Journal of the American Heart Association, finding something right in line with all of this, that the more plant-based you eat, the lower...
Yeah, that's true. Okay, I agree with all this. You're going to have a low risk of heart disease. There's a really important set of points to make about this, though. Actually, you know what? If we go back to that, did he say deaths? Okay, this is actually wrong. And the reason this is wrong is because not all... Okay, perfect. The reason this is wrong is not all heart attacks actually lead to... Okay, Okay, first of all, not all heart attacks lead to death, and not all strokes lead to death. So you can't go from the rate of ischemic heart disease to the rate of deaths from heart attacks, and you can't go from the rate of strokes to the rate of deaths from strokes. And this is actually really important. And let's go dive into a couple of details real quick here, because this is actually how they define heart disease in this particular study. And it includes a lot of things. It includes angina pectoris, which is basically pain in the chest. It includes a bunch of other things, including like an aneurysm of the heart, ischemic cardiomyopathy, a bunch of other things that aren't heart attacks. So these are actually, these can be chronic conditions that you have for your life and that don't necessarily kill you. Some of them can actually be relatively, it's not fun to have angina, but they can be things that aren't going, well, okay, so they're all going to be pretty terrible, but they're not necessarily going to kill you. And there's a wide range of things. It's not necessarily just heart attacks at all. Whereas hemorrhagic stroke, it's basically one of the worst sorts of cardiovascular, cerebrovascular events that you can have happen to you. It's often described as the worst headache you've ever had in your life. Basically, it's like basically feeling like your hammer's banging on your head for all day. That's basically your brain is bleeding, your blood vessels are bleeding into your brain, and the rate of death is extremely high compared to, say, angina, or compared to many kinds of heart attacks. Now, that's not to say that the rate of mortality from heart attacks isn't high, it is, but the rate of mortality from hemorrhagic stroke is much higher, and in fact, the brain damage from hemorrhagic stroke is much worse than any sort of brain damage that people generally have from heart attacks. So you have to ask the question, well, would you rather have a hemorrhagic stroke, or would you rather have a heart attack? Well, on the whole, since it's about an increase in 3 per 1,000 per year of strokes versus a rate of about 10 per year for CVD, for cardiovascular disease, these diagnoses, it's about a 3 times greater chance of having 3 times additional risk of having cardiovascular disease versus hemorrhagic stroke, which is important too. Even though hemorrhagic stroke is more disabling and it's more deadly, the heart attacks are going to happen at a much higher rate. So you have to make that trade-off, and it's not the easiest trade-off to make. I would still make it in favor of having a heart attack, but different people can make different decisions about that, and that's what people should be able to do. They should be able to make a decision about whether or not they go vegan based upon what is the risk of ischemic heart disease and what is the risk of stroke. If anybody's fear-mongering here and distorting data in order to scare people or encourage people through deceptive practices to be vegan as opposed to be a meat eater, it's this guy.
Not a perfect number, but good enough for this. And playing along with risk of stroke, if we look at it, and this study came out somewhat recently in the Journal of the American Heart Association.
Yeah, this is true. This is
finding
good.
Something right in line with all of this, that the more
plant-based diets prevent cardiovascular disease, almost certainly.
You eat, the lower your mortality risk is. Now, it's important to remember that we're talking about a group of almost all vegetarians here with some vegans. This is not a great representation of vegans. And vegetarians have...
Who cares if it's a great representation of vegans? Vegans are only 5 or 10% of all the plant-based population, if you want to call plant-based, if you want to include vegetarians and plant-based. Who cares if it's a great representation of vegans? Whenever you're a vegan and you're talking about plant-based diets, people who are going to listen to you are going to be average people who are not necessarily going to go onto a vegan diet. So if you're influencing those people and causing them to, for example, have a higher rate of hemorrhagic stroke by virtue of that particular choice, it's really important that you are aware of what you're doing, and you don't just care about the hardcore, the hardliners in your particular tribe, and you actually care about the people that you're influencing. You have a responsibility for that.
Have some limitations that vegans don't in terms of artery health. Looking to Dr. Esselstyn's whole food vegan diet trial on 200 people. Now, they started out with advanced
There's so many problems with Esselstyn's trial. It's in many ways fundamentally flawed trial, and I don't trust that data. So, we can talk about that some other time. Trolls, come on, we'll talk about Esselstyn, and we'll make a video about it as well, but let's keep going.
Cardiovascular disease after 12 years, the 177 that stuck with the diet virtually had no heart attack and stroke. No,
this is just nonsense.
0.6% rate of heart attack and stroke. And comparing these people to themselves, a lot of them had high rates of heart attack and stroke before going on the diet as well. Boom, went down to basically 0.
This is just so misleading.
Worth mentioning. So being afraid of going on a vegan diet for cardiovascular outcomes, that's kind of like being afraid of getting frostbite in the Bahamas. Some of you...
He sounds like Gregor here.
You might be wondering, maybe there were some conflicts of interest. Looking down at their financial disclosures, they do mention a grant that includes the trigger word livestock on this topic, but it's possible that it just means this grant is used to study the topic of livestock as well. It seems like they're neutral in the sense that they're perpetuating the status quo of meat consumption. They're not necessarily...
Wow, they're perpetuating the status quo. They're reactionary scientists.
Anti-plant-based, but the grant program does say that it will, quote, also involve partnering with Sainsbury's to test how changes in demand for animal-sourced food could be achieved. It's a little bit worrisome, but I personally don't think that this aspect influenced the outcomes of the study at all, or the researchers, especially given the researchers' statements, like how there were less deaths in the vegetarian group. I think it was more of just getting into the statistical mud a little bit too much, and it was really the BBC's fault for going out and pushing those titles out there. In the end, and the study had its flaws. It likely over-adjusted for a bunch of things, and it did not line up with more powerful, more methodologically sound
That's just totally false. They're not more powerful, methodologically sound studies. They're studies that looking at other studies, which includes this kind of study. And this guy is just totally misleading.
Studies on the same topic using more data. Those showed that there wasn't an increase in stroke, but all of them across the board showed
Keep preaching, man.
a decrease in heart disease, which is, again, our leading killer. But it is worth mentioning that none of the findings in the study were statistically significant on vegans in particular. Again, we can't make any claims about vegans from the study, really. So really, in the end, the BBC did a trash, horrible...
You can make conclusions based about the vast majority of people who are actually going to go on a plant-based diet, which you're influencing.
job at reporting, trying to smear plant-based diets.
They're not trying to smear things, they're reporting facts.
Once again, probably to get more clicks, a sad state of affairs.
What are you trying to do?
And the saddest part of all of this is that they're scaring people away from a vegan diet, which includes a whole food vegan diet, which could be...
Listen, the facts don't scare people away. The facts allow people to make better choices.
humanity's best hope at actually stopping stroke in its tracks based off of the studies that we have. All right, let me know what you thought about this. I really tried to crank this video out for you guys quickly so that it was relevant still. And special thanks
It's obvious you tried to crank it out quickly.
to everybody that sent me the article right away so I could get started on this issue. And also, if you want to be supporting what I'm doing, feel free to check out my Patreon. And sadly, my support's actually gone down a little bit, but it also helps to support me with your finger on the like button. Of course, subscribe, notification bell, all that jazz. All right, thanks for watching. Feel free to like and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video.
If you're one of his patrons, you should become my patron.